In the vast expanse of the Galactic Council's war room, where beings from 1,000 worlds gathered to plan the defense against the Vex swarm, laughter echoed off crystalline walls. The source? A human general's proposal to deploy war dogs alongside their troops. The Zephyrians, with their 6 arms and tactical brilliance, chittered in amusement. The stone-skinned Gorvok shook their massive heads in disbelief. Even the ethereal Luminari, beings of pure energy, flickered with what could only be interpreted as cosmic humor. Primitive mammals whispered the Vex intelligence intercepts they'd captured. Humans bond with lesser creatures. Weakness. But in the darkness between stars, where ancient evils stirred and civilizations fell like dominoes, they were all about to learn a truth as old as humanity itself. Never underestimate the power of loyalty forged in blood, sweat, and unconditional love. The war was about to teach the galaxy what it truly meant when humans said, "Good boy." The transport ship Cerberus drifted through the void toward the contested moon of Arcturus 7, its hull scarred from previous battles against the Vex swarm. Inside the cramped military quarters, Sergeant Marcus Chun scratched behind the ears of a German shepherd whose dark eyes held intelligence that seemed almost human. The dog's name was Koenig, and he had been Chin's partner for 3 years of the bloodiest conflict the galaxy had ever witnessed. "Still can't believe they approved this," muttered Corporal Rodriguez from across the narrow corridor, watching Chun work with Koenig on tactical signals. "The brass must be getting desperate." Chun looked up, his weathered face showing the strain of countless battles. "The Zephyrians have their quantum computers that can predict enemy movements 3 steps ahead. The Gorvok have armor that can withstand plasma bombardment. The Luminari can phase through solid matter. And us? We have dogs." The irony wasn't lost on anyone aboard the human vessels heading toward what military analysts called a suicide mission. Arcturus 7 had fallen to the Vex swarm 2 weeks ago, and every attempt to retake it had resulted in complete annihilation of the attacking force. The Vex, an insectoid race with a hive mind that spanned light years, had proven nearly impossible to combat using conventional tactics. The other species in the Galactic Council had already written off the moon as lost. Let the humans throw themselves against the Vex, the Zephyrian ambassador had said during the emergency council session. When they fail like the rest of us, perhaps they'll understand the futility of this war. What the ambassador and his colleagues didn't understand was that humans had been preparing for this kind of warfare for millennia, long before they reached the stars. In the cargo holds of the human fleet, alongside standard military equipment, were 300 dogs of various breeds, each paired with a human soldier in a bond that transcended simple training. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the mission commander, made her way through the ship's corridors, stopping to observe the human canine teams as they prepared for deployment. She watched as a Belgian Malinois named Nova worked with her handler, Staff Sergeant Williams, practicing silent communication signals that had taken months to perfect. The dog's nose twitched constantly, already adapting to the recycled air of the ship and the sense of her packmates. "Captain," Williams called out as he noticed her watching. "Nova's been picking up something strange in the ventilation system. Not sure what it is, but she's been alert for the past hour." Mitchell frowned and activated her comm unit. "Engineering, run a full diagnostic on the ventilation systems. We might have a contamination issue." Within minutes, the ship's engineers discovered traces of Vex pheromones that had somehow infiltrated their air supply, likely from microscopic particles that had adhered to their hull during their last encounter. The concentration was so minimal that human noses couldn't detect it, and even their sophisticated sensors had missed it. But Nova had caught it immediately. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Chief Engineer Thompson as he reviewed the readings. "If we deployed with that contamination, the Vex would have known we were coming before we even reached the surface." This wasn't the first time the dogs had proven their worth during the voyage. 3 days earlier, a pack of military working dogs had detected a Vex infiltrator unit that had managed to breach their outer hull using some kind of phase technology. The creatures had been virtually invisible to human eyes and completely undetectable by their scanning equipment, but the dogs had sensed their alien biochemistry immediately. As the fleet approached Arcturus 7, the full scope of the Vex occupation became clear. The moon's surface, once dotted with research facilities and mining operations, now writhed with organic structures that pulsed with an eerie bioluminescence. Massive spires twisted skyward like infected bones, and between them, countless Vex warriors scuttled in perfect synchronization. Intelligence estimates put their numbers at over 50,000, reported Lieutenant Commander Hayes during the final briefing. They've had 2 weeks to fortify their positions and adapt the terrain to their needs. Every approach vector is covered by weapons and placements that can track targets at the molecular level. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While the main human force would conduct a frontal assault to draw Vex attention, smaller teams paired with dogs would infiltrate through underground tunnel systems that the Vex had overlooked. The dogs would serve as early warning systems, detecting enemies long before human senses could pick them up, and their ability to navigate in complete darkness would be crucial in the subterranean environment. Shin found himself assigned to Team Alpha, along with Koenig and 5 other soldiers. Their mission was to reach the primary Vex command node and plan explosive charges that would disrupt the hive mind's coordination in this sector. It was a job that required stealth, precision, and the kind of intuitive teamwork that only came from absolute trust. As they prepared for deployment, Chen ran through the mission parameters one more time with Koenig. The dog sat at attention, his intelligent eyes focused completely on his handler's face, reading every subtle expression and gesture. Chen had learned to trust Koenig's instincts more than his own tactical training, a lesson that had saved both their lives on numerous occasions. "Remember, boy," Chen whispered, rubbing the dog's head affectionately. "Stay close, stay quiet, and trust your nose. If you smell danger, you let me know immediately." Koenig's tail wagged once, a brief acknowledgement that he understood. The dog had been trained to control even his most basic responses during missions, understanding somehow that their lives often depended on absolute silence. The drop pods launched from the fleet in waves, streaking through Arcturus 7's thin atmosphere like falling stars. The Vex immediately responded, filling the sky with plasma fire and deploying swarms of flying interceptors. This was exactly what the human commanders had wanted. Every Vex warrior and weapon focused on the obvious threat descending from above. Chen's team deployed from their pod 3 kilometers from the target zone, immediately taking cover in a ruined research station. Koenig's nose worked constantly as they moved, processing the alien scents that now dominated the moon's atmosphere. The dog had been exposed to Vex pheromones during training, learning to distinguish between different castes of warriors and their various emotional states. As they approached the entrance to the underground tunnel system, Koenig suddenly froze, his body going rigid with alert tension. Chen immediately signaled for the team to halt, trusting his partner's instincts completely. For several minutes, they remained motionless while Koenig tested the air currents. Finally, the dog relaxed slightly and moved forward, indicating that whatever he had sensed was no longer an immediate threat. Chen followed, knowing that Koenig had likely detected a Vex patrol that had passed through the area recently. The dog's ability to track the movement patterns of their enemies through scent trails would be invaluable in the tunnels ahead. The entrance to the underground facility was a gaping wound in the earth, torn open by Vex excavation equipment that had burrowed through solid rock like it was soft clay. The tunnels beyond stretched into darkness that seemed to absorb their tactical lights, creating an environment where human technology was nearly useless. But Koenig moved forward confidently, his enhanced senses painting a detailed map of the environment that Shun had learned to read through the subtle language of the dog's body movements. When Koenig's ears perked forward, it meant something interesting ahead. With his hackles raised, danger was approaching. When he lowered his body and moved with deliberate caution, they were entering territory claimed by the enemy. As Team Alpha descended into the tunnel system, they passed through chambers that showed evidence of hasty Vex construction. The walls were covered with a resinous substance that seemed to pulse with its own life, and the air carried an acrid smell that burned human nostrils, but didn't seem to bother Koenig at all. "This stuff is definitely organic," whispered Specialist Carter, the team's demolitions expert, as he took readings with his scanner. "It's like they're growing the tunnel walls rather than building them." Koenig suddenly stopped and turned his head toward a side passage that seemed identical to the dozens they had already passed. Chen knew better than to question his partner's judgment. He signaled for the team to investigate the passage, trusting that Koenig had detected something their instruments had missed. 50 meters down the side tunnel, they discovered a chamber filled with what appeared to be Vex communication equipment, massive biomechanical constructs that pulsed with data flows between the surface and whatever central intelligence coordinated the swarm's activities. It was a target of opportunity that could significantly damage the enemy's ability to coordinate their defenses. But as Carter began setting charges on the equipment, Koenig's behavior became increasingly agitated. The dog kept looking back toward the tunnel entrance, his tail rigid and his breathing shallow. Chen had seen this behavior before, during their escape from the Vex-occupied mining station on Kepler 442b. It meant they were about to be trapped. "We need to move," Chen said quietly, trusting his partner's warning. "Now!" The team quickly finished their sabotage work and began retreating toward the main tunnel. They had barely reached the junction when the chamber behind them filled with Vex warriors that seemed to materialize from the walls themselves. The creatures moved in perfect silence, their chitinous legs making no sound on the organic floor surfaces. Koenig had saved their lives again, detecting the approaching enemies through some combination of scent, vibration, and instinct that human science still couldn't fully explain. As they moved deeper into the tunnel system, Chun couldn't help but think about the doubters back at Galactic Council headquarters. Every species in the Alliance had contributed their most advanced technology to the war effort, but sometimes the most effective weapons were the simplest ones. The bond between human and dog had been forged over thousands of years of shared evolution, creating a partnership that operated on levels deeper than conscious thought. While the Zephyrians relied on their quantum computers and the Gorvok trusted their massive firepower, humans had learned to trust something far more primitive and infinitely more reliable, the instincts of a creature that had chosen to link its fate with theirs. As they approached the primary target zone, Koenig's behavior indicated increasing Vex activity ahead. The dog's training had prepared him for this moment, when stealth and precision would determine not just the success of their mission, but the survival of every human in the fleet above. Chen checked his equipment one final time and looked down at his four-legged partner, seeing the same determination in Koenig's eyes that he felt in his own heart. The real test was about to begin, and the galaxy was about to learn why humans had chosen to go to war with their oldest allies by their sides. The Vex command node sprawled before them like a living cathedral of nightmares, its biomechanical walls pulsing with streams of data that flowed between thousands of neural interfaces. Koenig's nose twitched as he processed the complex cocktail of pheromones emanating from the structure, his training allowing him to distinguish between different types of Vex communications and alert levels. Chun studied the massive chamber through his scope, counting at least 30 Vex warriors of various castes positioned around the central processing core. The creatures moved with the mechanical precision of a hive mind, each one perfectly coordinated with the others in a dance of alien efficiency that had crushed every previous assault against their positions. "How do we get through that?" whispered Rodriguez, his voice barely audible even through their closed-circuit communications. Before Chun could respond, Koenig began a series of subtle movements that the sergeant had learned to interpret over their years of partnership. The dog was reading scent trails, analyzing the patterns of Vex movement, and mapping the chamber's air currents with an accuracy that surpassed any human technology. Koenig moved toward the left side of the chamber, staying low and using the organic protrusions from the walls as cover. Chun followed, trusting his partner's assessment of the safest route. The other team members spread out behind them, each one understanding that their survival depended on following the dog's guidance through this alien maze. As they advanced, Chen noticed that Koenig was leading them along paths where the air currents carried human scents away from the Vex guards rather than toward them. The dog had somehow mapped the entire ventilation pattern of the chamber just by testing the air for a few minutes, demonstrating the kind of spatial intelligence that human scientists were only beginning to understand. They reached a position just 20 meters from the central core when Koenig suddenly froze, his entire body radiating alert tension. Chen immediately signaled for the team to halt, knowing that his partner had detected something that their instruments had missed. For several heart-stopping moments, they remained motionless while Koenig processed whatever he had sensed. The dog's head turned toward a section of wall that appeared identical to every other surface in the chamber. His ears moved slightly, indicating that he was tracking sounds beyond human hearing range. Then, his nose began working more intensively, as if he was analyzing a particularly complex scent signature. Chun watched the wall section Koenig was focused on, waiting for his partner to provide more information. After what felt like an eternity, the dog made a subtle gesture that Chun recognized as a warning about hidden enemies. Somehow, Koenig had detected Vex warriors concealed within the wall structure itself, waiting to ambush anyone who approached the central core. Using hand signals, Chen communicated this information to his team. Carter nodded and began adjusting his explosive charges, preparing to create a diversion that would force the hidden enemies into the open. But Koenig's behavior suggested that the situation was more complex than a simple ambush. The dog was now focused on multiple points throughout the chamber, his attention shifting between different locations as he built a complete picture of the threats they faced. Chen realized that Koenig wasn't just detecting the obvious guards and hidden warriors. He was mapping the entire defensive network through scent analysis, identifying command hierarchies, emotional states, and even individual Vex identities. Koenig's training had included extensive exposure to captured Vex specimens, allowing him to learn the subtle differences in their biochemistry that indicated rank, function, and current activity level. Now he was using that knowledge to provide his human partner with intelligence that no electronic surveillance system could match. The dog made a series of precise movements that Chun translated into tactical information. The central cluster of Vex warriors were drones, operating under direct control from a command cast hidden in the ceiling structure above the core. The wall-mounted guardians were hunter-killers, designed to eliminate intruders who managed to penetrate the outer defenses. And scattered throughout the chamber were sensory specialists whose enhanced perception abilities rivaled Koenig's own. But Koenig had also identified weaknesses in the defensive arrangement. The Vex had designed their security to counter conventional attack patterns, expecting enemies to approach the core directly. They hadn't anticipated infiltrators who could map their positions without triggering their sensory networks, or who could identify the optimal timing for an assault based on the natural rhythms of the hive mind's attention cycles. Koenig indicated that the guard rotation would shift in approximately 3 minutes, based on the pheromone patterns he was detecting. During that brief window, the sensory specialists will be focused on processing status reports from throughout the facility, creating a gap in their perimeter awareness. Chun quickly relayed this information to his team, and they began preparing for what would essentially be a perfectly timed surgical strike. Carter positioned his charges to target the command cast positions that Koenig had identified, while Williams and Jackson prepared to neutralize the wall-mounted guardians. Rodriguez would provide covering fire for their retreat, and Chen would accompany Koenig to the central core to plant the primary demolition charge. As the moment approached, Koenig's body language indicated increasing tension among the Vex guards. The dog could sense the shift in their pheromone signatures that preceded the rotation cycle, giving Chun a countdown more accurate than any chronometer. When Koenig's subtle signal indicated that the moment had arrived, Team Alpha struck with a precision that would have impressed even the Zephyrians. Carter's charges detonated simultaneously, collapsing sections of the ceiling and eliminating the command cast before they could coordinate a response. Williams and Jackson engaged the Wall Guardians with weapons specifically designed to counter Vex armor, while Rodriguez laid down suppressing fire that kept the remaining drones from organizing an effective counterattack. Chun and Koenig sprinted toward the central core, the dog leading them through a route that avoided the remaining defensive positions. As they ran, Chun could hear the distinctive chittering sounds that indicated the Vex were attempting to re-establish command coordination, but without their primary control nodes, their response was chaotic and uncoordinated. Koenig reached the core first and immediately began circling it, his nose working to identify any hidden defensive measures. The dog's behavior indicated that the structure was heavily booby-trapped, but his analysis of the chemical signatures was providing Chun with a safe approach vector. Following Koenig's guidance, Chun planted the primary charge on a specific section of the core that the dog had identified as containing the most critical data pathways. The explosive was designed to create a cascade failure that would propagate throughout the entire Vex network on Arcturus 7, effectively severing the hive mind's control over their forces. But as Chun activated the timer, Koenig's behavior suddenly changed. The dog's hackles rose, and he began backing away from the core, his body language indicating extreme danger. Chun had learned to trust these warnings without question, and he immediately began retreating from the device he had just armed. They had barely reached cover when the core itself began to split open, revealing a massive Vex overlord that had been dormant within the structure. The creature was unlike anything in the intelligence reports, easily 3 times the size of the largest warrior caste they had previously encountered. Its psychic presence was so powerful that it created visible distortions in the air around it, and its emergence triggered alarm responses throughout the facility. The Overlord's attention focused immediately on the explosive device that Chun had planted, and the creature began moving toward it with obvious intent to disable the charge. But Koenig was already in motion, using his speed and agility to position himself between the Overlord and the bomb. What happened next would become legend among human forces throughout the galaxy. Koenig, a 70-pound German shepherd, faced down a creature that weighed several tons and possessed psychic abilities that could dominate most sentient minds. But dogs had been bred for courage long before humans reached the stars, and Koenig had spent his entire life learning to trust his human partner above all other considerations. The dog didn't attack the Overlord directly. Instead, he used the tactics he had been trained for, creating noise and movement that disrupted the creature's concentration while staying just out of reach of its massive claws. Koenig's barking echoed through the chamber, a sound that seemed to cause the Overlord genuine distress, as if the dog's vocalizations were somehow interfering with its psychic abilities. Chun realized what Koenig was doing and began coordinating his team's fire on the Overlord, using the dog's distraction to target weak points in the creature's armor. But the real battle was being fought on a level that human weapons couldn't affect. The Overlord was attempting to dominate Koenig's mind, just as it would with any other sentient creature. What the Vex intelligence hadn't anticipated was that dogs operated on a fundamentally different psychological level than most species. Their loyalty wasn't based on rational calculation or self-interest, but on emotional bonds that had been reinforced through thousands of generations of coevolution with humans. Koenig's mind wasn't structured like that of a typical sentient being. It was organized around pack loyalty, protective instincts, and an absolute trust in his human partner that transcended rational thought. The Overlord's psychic attack crashed against Koenig's consciousness like a wave against a stone. The dog's mind simply didn't have the complex rational structures that psychic domination required to function. Instead, it had something far more powerful, an unshakable certainty about his purpose and his relationship with Chun. Koenig's resistance bought the team the precious seconds they needed. Chun's explosive charge detonated exactly as planned, sending cascading failures throughout the Vex network. The Overlord's massive form began convulsing as it lost connection with the hive mind, its individual consciousness suddenly isolated for the first time in its existence. But the explosion also triggered the facility's self-destruct systems, and Team Alpha found themselves trapped in a collapsing structure with hundreds of panicked Vex warriors between them and the exit. The creatures were no longer operating under central coordination, but their individual survival instincts made them even more dangerous in some ways. Koenig immediately began leading the team through the chaos, his senses guiding them along routes that avoided the worst of the structural damage and the most concentrated groups of Vex survivors. The dog seemed to understand intuitively which passages would remain stable long enough for them to pass through, and which areas were too dangerous to attempt. As they fought their way toward the surface, Chen couldn't help but marvel at his partner's performance. Koenig had not only guided them through the mission successfully, but had faced down an opponent that should have been able to destroy him with a thought. The dog's courage and loyalty had proven stronger than alien psychic abilities, demonstrating the power of bonds that had been forged in the crucible of shared evolution. They reached the surface just as the underground facility completed its collapse, sealing the Vex command network permanently. Around them, the sounds of battle were changing as the hive mind's coordination failure spread throughout the Vex forces on Arcturus 7. The creatures were fighting as individuals now, their tactical superiority evaporating as they lost the collective intelligence that had made them nearly invincible. Koenig sat beside Chun as they waited for extraction, his tail wagging slightly despite the exhaustion that showed in every line of his body. The dog had done exactly what he had been trained to do: protect his pack, follow his human partner, and never give up no matter how overwhelming the odds. Above them, the human fleet was beginning its final assault on the disorganized Vex forces, taking advantage of the chaos that Team Alpha had created. But Chen knew that the real victory had been won by a German shepherd whose loyalty had proven stronger than alien technology, whose courage had faced down psychic domination, and whose partnership with humanity represented something that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. News of the victory at Arcturus 7 spread through the Galactic Council like wildfire, but the initial reports focused on human tactical innovations and the effectiveness of their explosive charges against Vex bioarchitecture. The role of the war dogs was mentioned only in passing, dismissed by most military analysts as a minor support element that had little bearing on the overall success of the operation. That dismissive attitude began to change when the detailed after-action reports reached the Council's Strategic Planning Committee. Admiral Kethvar, the Zephyrian military leader who had initially mocked the human proposal, found himself reading accounts of canine performance that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare and intelligence gathering. "This cannot be accurate," he muttered to his aide, reviewing surveillance footage that showed Koenig detecting hidden Vex positions through scent analysis. "Their instruments are clearly malfunctioning. No biological creature could process tactical information with this level of precision." But the evidence was overwhelming. Not only had the dogs detected threats that the most advanced sensors had missed, but they had demonstrated forms of intelligence that didn't fit into any of the established categories that galactic science used to classify sentient behavior. The bond between human and canine appeared to operate on a level that transcended individual consciousness, creating a hybrid intelligence that was greater than the sum of its parts. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead xenobiologist studying human-canine partnerships, was fielding requests for information from research institutions across the galaxy. Her preliminary reports on the Arcturus 7 mission had described capabilities that seemed almost magical to species that had never experienced the coevolutionary process that had shaped the relationship between humans and dogs. The canines appeared to be capable of forming cognitive maps based entirely on olfactory information, she explained to a gathering of council scientists. They can track the movement patterns of individual enemies through complex environments, predict behavioral changes based on pheromone analysis, and even detect emotional states that indicate tactical intentions. The Luminari representative, a being of pure energy called radiance of understanding, flickered with what passed for skepticism among its species. This suggests capabilities that approach prescience. How do you explain such abilities in creatures that your own species describes as non-sentient? Vasquez smiled, having anticipated this question. That's exactly the point. We've been looking at intelligence the wrong way. We assume that consciousness and rational thought are prerequisites for sophisticated information processing, but the dogs operate on entirely different principles. Their intelligence is distributed, emotional, and intuitive rather than centralized and logical. Meanwhile, in the field, the success at Arcturus 7 had led to expanded deployment of human canine teams throughout the war zone. Each mission provided new data on the capabilities and limitations of these partnerships, building a body of knowledge that was reshaping military thinking across the galaxy. Captain Sarah Mitchell found herself commanding a task force specifically designed to test the limits of canine-assisted warfare. Her ships carried not just the standard German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois, but specialized breeds selected for different tactical requirements. Bloodhounds for tracking, border collies for complex problem-solving, and even smaller breeds like Jack Russell Terriers whose size allowed them to access areas that larger dogs couldn't navigate. Their next target was the Vex fortress world of Zirian Prime, a planet that had been completely transformed into a massive hive structure. Intelligence indicated that the Vex had learned from their defeat at Arcturus 7 and had implemented new defensive measures specifically designed to counter human infiltration tactics. They flooded the atmosphere with artificial pheromones intended to confuse our dogs' senses, reported Lieutenant Hayes during the mission briefing. They've also deployed sonic weapons that operate at frequencies designed to disorient canine hearing. Chen looked down at Koenig, who was resting at his feet, but clearly alert to every word of the briefing. The dog had been fitted with protective equipment for this mission, including filters for his sensitive nose and sound-dampening devices for his ears. But Chen knew that his partner's greatest asset wasn't his enhanced senses alone. It was his ability to adapt and problem-solve in partnership with his human handler. "They're thinking like machines," Chen said quietly. "They analyzed our capabilities and developed countermeasures based on pure logic. But they don't understand what they're really fighting against." The assault on Zirian Prime began with a massive orbital bombardment that was intended primarily as a diversion. While Vex forces responded to the obvious threat from space, human infiltration teams deployed at multiple points across the planet's surface, each guided by canines who had been specifically trained for the environmental challenges they would face. Koenig and his team found themselves in a section of the Hive City where the artificial atmosphere was so saturated with confusing scents that human soldiers could barely breathe. The sonic weapons created a constant background noise that should have made it impossible for dogs to use their hearing effectively. But Koenig adapted with a flexibility that surprised even Chun. Unable to rely on his nose and ears in the traditional way, the dog began using these senses in combination with his other capabilities, building a more complex picture of his environment than he had ever attempted before. He learned to distinguish between artificial and natural scents by their chemical signatures, filtering out the Vex countermeasures to focus on the underlying information he needed. More importantly, Koenig began relying more heavily on his partnership with Chun, using their shared communication systems to supplement his compromised senses. The dog would indicate uncertainty about a particular area, and Chun would use his instruments to gather additional information that Koenig could then incorporate into his tactical assessment. "It's like watching evolution in real time," whispered Rodriguez as he observed Koenig adapting to each new challenge they encountered. The dog is learning to think differently. But the Vex had prepared more than environmental countermeasures. As the human teams penetrated deeper into the hive structure, they encountered Vex warriors that had been specifically modified to counter canine advantages. These creatures had enhanced stealth capabilities and biochemical signatures designed to mimic human pheromones, making them nearly invisible to standard detection methods. It was Koenig who first identified the nature of this new threat, not through his senses alone, but through his understanding of pack dynamics and territorial behavior. The modified Vex moved wrong, their artificial human sense failing to match the behavioral patterns that Koenig associated with his human packmates. The dog's social intelligence, honed through thousands of years of living with humans, allowed him to detect deception at a level that no technical countermeasure could address. When the first modified Vex warrior attempted to ambush the team, Koenig's warning came not as a response to any specific sensory input, but as a gut-level recognition that something in their environment didn't belong. The dog's growl was low and continuous, a sound that Chun had learned meant extreme danger from an unidentified source. The subsequent firefight was brief, but intense, with the modified Vex warrior demonstrating capabilities that would have overwhelmed a normal human patrol. But Koenig's warning had given Team Alpha the crucial seconds they needed to prepare, and their coordinated response eliminated the threat before it could adapt to their tactics. As they continued through the hive structure, Koenig's behavior began to change in ways that Chun had never observed before. The dog was becoming more proactive in his tactical assessments, apparently learning to anticipate Vex adaptations based on patterns he was detecting in their behavior. It was as if Koenig was developing a theoretical understanding of how his enemies thought, allowing him to predict their countermeasures before they were implemented. He's not just reacting anymore, Chun realized as he watched Koenig guide the team around a trap that no sensor could have detected. He's starting to think like a strategist. This evolution in Koenig's capabilities was being mirrored by dogs throughout the human forces. The Vex countermeasures, designed to neutralize specific canine abilities, had instead forced the dogs to develop new forms of intelligence that combined their natural gifts with learned behaviors in unprecedented ways. Dr. Vasquez, monitoring the mission from the command ship, was documenting changes in canine brain activity that suggested the formation of new neural pathways in real time. The dogs are literally rewiring their own consciousness to adapt to the challenges they're facing, she reported to the Galactic Council's emergency session. This level of cognitive flexibility is unprecedented in any species we've studied. The breakthrough came when Koenig led his team to what appeared to be a dead end in the hive structure's tunnel system. The dog spent several minutes investigating the area, his behavior indicating intense concentration, but no clear threat assessment. Finally, he began pawing at a specific section of the wall, his actions suggesting that something important lay beyond the barrier. Chin trusted his partner's instincts and directed Carter to investigate the area with explosives. When the wall collapsed, they discovered a vast chamber that contained what could only be described as a Vex nursery, filled with developing larvae that represented the next generation of warriors for this sector of the hive mind. But Koenig's attention wasn't focused on the obvious targets. Instead, he was investigating a cluster of more mature specimens that showed unusual development patterns. These creatures appeared to be evolving specifically to counter human canine tactics, their sensory organs enhanced beyond normal Vex capabilities, and their biochemistry modified to resist standard human weapons. They're trying to breed us out of the war, Chun realized as he studied the specimens. They're creating new warriors specifically designed to neutralize our advantages. The implications were staggering. The Vex had not only analyzed human-canine partnerships with scientific precision, but were actively evolving countermeasures at the genetic level. If these enhanced warriors reached maturity and were deployed throughout their forces, the tactical advantages that had won the battle at Arcturus 7 would be completely neutralized. But Koenig's discovery had provided the human forces with an opportunity to disrupt this development before it could reach fruition. Carter's charges were specifically designed to create biological contamination that would prevent the enhanced larvae from reaching maturity, effectively eliminating an entire generation of anti-human warriors. As the team prepared the charges, Koenig suddenly became agitated, his attention focused on sounds that were beyond human hearing. The dog's behavior indicated approaching threats, but his assessment suggested something different from their previous encounters with Vex forces. Chun realized what Koenig was detecting just as the first enhanced warriors entered the chamber. These creatures moved with a predatory grace that was distinctly different from normal Vex behavior, and their focus was immediately and specifically on the humans' canine partners. They had been designed not just to fight humans, but to eliminate the dogs that had become such a crucial element of human tactical superiority. The battle that followed would reshape the entire war, as enhanced Vex warriors faced off against the dogs they had been specifically created to destroy. But the Vex had made a fundamental miscalculation in their approach to this biological arms race. They had analyzed canine capabilities as fixed parameters that could be countered through superior design, not understanding that the true strength of human-canine partnerships lay not in any specific ability, but in their infinite capacity for adaptation and growth. Koenig and his packmates were about to demonstrate that the bond between species could evolve faster than any genetic manipulation, and that loyalty forged in the crucible of shared struggle was stronger than any weapon that science could create. The enhanced Vex warriors moved through the nursery chamber with a terrifying combination of alien intelligence and predatory instinct, their modified sensory organs locked onto the human canine teams with laser focus. These creatures represented millions of years of accelerated evolution compressed into weeks of biological engineering, specifically designed to neutralize humanity's most unexpected military asset. Koenig faced the lead warrior, a creature whose psychic abilities had been enhanced beyond those of even the overlord they had encountered at Arcturus 7. The Vex had learned from that previous encounter, strengthening their mind control capabilities and adding new frequencies specifically tuned to disrupt canine neural patterns. But as the psychic assault crashed against Koenig's consciousness, something unprecedented happened. The dog didn't resist the mental intrusion in the same way he had before. Instead, he seemed to redirect it, channeling the alien thoughts through his bond with Chun and into the broader network of human-canine partnerships throughout the mission. Chun felt the psychic pressure as a strange tingling in the back of his mind, but rather than the overwhelming domination that should have resulted from direct contact with enhanced Vex mental powers, he experienced something more like a translation. Koenig was somehow converting the alien thoughts into patterns that human consciousness could process and understand. Through this unexpected connection, Chun suddenly found himself seeing the Vex nursery through compound perspectives. His own tactical training, Koenig's sensory analysis, and even fragmented insights from the enhanced warrior's own perception. The experience was overwhelming, but incredibly revealing, showing him weaknesses in the Vex design that no purely human or purely canine intelligence could have detected. The neural link, Chun whispered into his comm, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The dogs aren't just adapting individually. They're sharing adaptations through us. Throughout the chamber, other human canine teams were experiencing similar phenomena. Each dog that encountered an enhanced Vex warrior was learning not just how to counter that specific threat, but was somehow transmitting that knowledge to their packmates through the emotional bonds they shared with their human partners. Williams watched in amazement as Nova, his Belgian Malinois, began moving in perfect coordination with dogs she had never worked with before, all of them responding to threats and opportunities that no individual animal should have been able to perceive. The canines were operating as a distributed intelligence network, using their human partners as connecting nodes in a communication system that transcended anything that formal military training had prepared them for. The enhanced Vex warriors have been designed to fight individual dogs or even coordinated pairs, but they were completely unprepared for the collective intelligence that was emerging from the human canine teams. Each tactical adaptation that one dog made was immediately available to all the others, creating a learning system that evolved faster than even their accelerated biological modifications could counter. "This is impossible," transmitted the Vex overlord controlling the enhanced warriors, its voice somehow reaching the human communication networks through the psychic links that Koenig had established. Individual creatures cannot form collective consciousness without technological integration. Koenig's response came not as words, but as a feeling that Chun translated for his team. The Overlord was thinking about consciousness in entirely the wrong way. The dogs weren't becoming a hive mind like the Vex. Instead, they were demonstrating that love and loyalty could create connections that were stronger and more flexible than any technological network. The battle raged through the nursery chamber as enhanced Vex warriors found their carefully designed advantages neutralized by opponents who refused to fight according to any predictable pattern. Each time a warrior adapted to counter a specific canine tactic, the dogs would collectively shift to an entirely different approach, their shared learning making them functionally unpredictable. Carter's explosive charges were ready for deployment, but the enhanced Vex warriors were specifically targeting the human demolitions expert, recognizing that destroying the nursery represented an existential threat to their species' evolutionary strategy. Multiple creatures converged on his position, moving with coordination that suggested they shared a tactical consciousness similar to what the dogs were demonstrating. Koenig broke away from his individual combat to assist Carter, but rather than simply attacking the Vex warriors directly, the dog began a complex series of movements that seemed designed to confuse their targeting systems. Chen realized that Koenig was exploiting a fundamental flaw in the enhanced warriors' design. Their sensory modifications made them incredibly sensitive to movement patterns, but that same sensitivity could be turned against them through deliberate misdirection. Following Koenig's lead, the other dogs began similar tactics, creating a symphony of movement that overloaded the enhanced warriors' perception systems. The creatures had been designed to track and eliminate specific targets with perfect precision, but faced with dozens of dogs moving in coordinated but unpredictable patterns, their targeting algorithms couldn't establish priority locks. Now, Chun shouted, and Carter triggered his charges. The explosion that followed destroyed not just the current generation of enhanced larvae, but also the biological templates that the Vex had used to create their anti-canine modifications. Decades of accelerated evolution research vanished in seconds, setting back the Vex adaptation efforts by centuries. But the victory came at a cost. The destruction of the nursery triggered automated responses throughout the hive structure, sealing exit routes, and releasing defensive measures that had been held in reserve. Team Alpha found themselves trapped in a collapsing section of the facility, with enhanced Vex warriors still hunting them through corridors that were becoming increasingly unstable. Koenig took point, leading the team through passages that his enhanced perception indicated were still structurally sound. But even his remarkable abilities were being pushed to their limits as the hive structure's bow architecture began actively reconfiguring itself to prevent their escape. The dog's behavior indicated extreme stress as he tried to process the constantly changing layout of corridors that seemed to shift and flow like living tissue. The Vex had designed their structures to be incomprehensible to conventional navigation systems, but Koenig was adapting his spatial intelligence in real time, learning to think in terms of organic flow patterns rather than fixed architectural layouts. Chun watched his partner working at the very edge of his capabilities, and for the first time in their partnership, he saw uncertainty in Koenig's movements. The dog was pushing himself beyond his natural limits, driven by the same protective instincts that had made him face down the Overlord at Arcturus 7. "Easy, boy," Chun whispered, placing a reassuring hand on Koenig's head. "We trust you. Take your time." The simple gesture of support seemed to restore Koenig's confidence, and the dog's navigation became more assured as he integrated Chin's emotional stability into his own decision-making process. The human-canine bond wasn't just about the dog's enhanced capabilities. It was equally about the human partner providing the emotional foundation that allowed those capabilities to function under extreme stress. They reached what appeared to be an exit point, just as the hive structure's reconfiguration process accelerated. The walls around them were beginning to close, and the air was filling with acidic compounds that the Vex used to break down biological matter. Koenig's nose was already showing irritation from the chemicals, but the dog continued, leading them forward with determined precision. The exit turned out to be a vertical shaft that led to the surface, but The climbing surface was covered with the same resinous material that characterized Vex bioarchitecture. Human hands couldn't get sufficient grip on the slippery surface, and their equipment wasn't designed for this type of emergency ascent. Koenig solved the problem with typical canine ingenuity. His claws could grip the resin surface effectively, and his understanding of pack dynamics allowed him to coordinate with his human partners in creating a climbing system that used both species' capabilities. The dog would establish anchor points that humans could use for support, while the humans provided boost assistance that allowed Koenig to reach positions he couldn't access on his own. It was slow, dangerous work, with the shaft itself showing signs of the same structural instability that was affecting the rest of the hive. But the teamwork between human and canine partners allowed them to ascend at a pace that stayed just ahead of the collapsing structure below them. They emerged onto the surface of Xerion Prime just as the underground nursery complex completed its self-destruction, taking with it the Vex primary research facility for anti-human adaptations. The loss would cripple their ability to counter human-canine tactics for the foreseeable future, potentially shifting the balance of the entire war. Koenig sat beside Chun as they waited for extraction, his breathing labored, but his tail still wagging with satisfaction at a mission completed successfully. The dog showed clear signs of exhaustion from operating beyond his normal limits, but his bond with his human partner had allowed him to achieve things that should have been impossible for any individual creature. Above them, the human fleet was already exploiting the intelligence gathered during the mission, deploying human-canine teams throughout the Vex-occupied sectors with tactics specifically designed to counter the enhanced warriors. The collective learning that the dogs had demonstrated was being systematized and transmitted to teams throughout the war zone, turning individual adaptations into universal capabilities. Dr. Vasquez's preliminary analysis of the mission data was already reshaping scientific understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and the possibilities for interspecies cooperation. The human-canine partnership had evolved beyond anything that either species could have achieved independently, creating a hybrid form of intelligence that combined the best characteristics of both. The implications extend far beyond military applications, she reported to the Galactic Council's emergency session. We're seeing evidence of consciousness that transcends individual minds, intelligence that emerges from emotional bonds rather than rational calculation, and problem-solving abilities that adapt faster than any technological system. Admiral Kethvar, the Zephyrian military leader who had initially dismissed the human proposal, found himself studying footage of Koenig's performance with something approaching awe. How do we integrate these capabilities into broader coalition forces? He asked. Can other species develop similar partnerships? The question would prove crucial to the war's ultimate outcome, but the answer was already emerging from human settlements throughout the galaxy. Other species were beginning to observe that humans formed similar bonds, not just with dogs, but with a variety of creatures that shared specific characteristics: loyalty, intelligence, and the capacity for emotional connection that transcended rational self-interest. Chen looked down at Koenig, who was now resting but still alert to every sound and movement around them. The dog had faced down alien psychic powers, adapted to environmental countermeasures, and pushed the boundaries of his own capabilities in service to the pack he had chosen. More than that, he had helped demonstrate that the strongest weapons weren't always the most sophisticated ones. As the extraction shuttle approached, Chen realized that the galaxy was about to learn something that humans had known for thousands of years. The bonds forged in friendship, tested in adversity, and strengthened through mutual loyalty were more powerful than any technology. The Vex had tried to engineer solutions to the human-canine partnership, but they had been attempting to counter something that operated on levels they couldn't comprehend. The war was far from over, but humanity and its four-legged allies had proven that some advantages couldn't be analyzed, copied, or defeated through superior force. They had shown the galaxy that sometimes the most effective weapon was simply a good dog who knew that his human needed him. Koenig's tail wagged one more time as the shuttle landed, a simple gesture that carried the weight of an entire species' redemption. The galaxy had laughed at human soldiers and their animal companions, but the laughter had stopped when they learned what good boy really meant in the crucible of interstellar war.